All right, and we're recording. Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to the LTP podcast. Today we have Professor Kiran Kedlaya. How do you usually introduce yourself?
I guess I tell people I'm a professor in the math department at UC San Diego. Um, we'll start from there. I mean, I have to confess that telling people that you're a math professor often sort of shuts the conversation down.
Does it really?
So I try not to lead with that necessarily. But
Oh, really?
no, I mean, I tell people I'm a professor at UCSD and I teach in the math department and take it from there.
So if that usually shuts down conversations, what what do you usually try to start with then?
I guess I might start with other things that I'm interested in.
Okay, what
I mean, of course, math is something that is a subject I'm interested in, but I also enjoy, you know, music and foreign languages and photography and other things. So, games and puzzles. So sometimes the conversation will be going in one of those directions.
Yeah, yeah. I think we've talked about a couple of those. I didn't hear you say anything about photography before, though. I've always been wanting to get into it, but
Yeah,
I've never
I
gotten the
got into
chance.
photography. Originally, I got into photography back when it was film. So this was when I was much younger. And then I sort of didn't keep it up for a while. But then once the cameras went digital, it became much easier. So I got back into it, and uh, it happens that my work involves a lot of travel. Obviously, not right now, but under normal circumstances, being a research scientist um, of any sort generally means traveling to give presentations at conferences, to visit with collaborators. Um, there's a lot of travel both within the country and internationally. So basically, whenever I'm going someplace interesting, especially someplace I haven't been, I'll grab my camera and take it with me. And I think I've been to maybe 80 countries by now. So I have a lot of pictures of a lot of countries.
That is quite a few.
And yeah, I keep a lot of pictures on my website, mostly to help me remember places I've been. But
Mhm.
I hope other people enjoy them too.
It is really nice to be able to look back on the stuff that you've traveled to, or like when you're watching a show. I don't know. Once we started traveling, we were like, oh hey, we've been there.
Yeah, it really gives you connections with places around the world. Like, um, I think I was watching the finale of The Good Place, which has a scene in Paris, and I knew exactly where they were because I've been in Paris many times.
Yeah, yeah.
It
Sometimes you're
gives you a
watching
different
it.
connection to seeing a picture of some place or seeing video of some place if you've been in that place and you've been on that street, you've been in that neighborhood, because places around the world all have their own look. I mean,
Mhm.
just even within the US. I mean, the first time I came to California, I remember being struck that, oh, this doesn't look like the East Coast at all. Uh, the houses are much flatter. There are palm trees. The streets are, there are these wide boulevards and avenues. And the trees are, besides the palm trees, the other trees are all different. There's eucalyptus. There's all sorts of things that we don't have on the East Coast.
Yeah.
And there's the mission style of architecture, and yeah, it just even going from one part of the U.S. to another, you see these differences, and even more so when you start going outside the U.S. Um, or outside of your own country, if your country is not the U.S. And yeah, and you bring some of that back with you, of course. Travel changes, the traveler as well as the location. So yeah, you come back with some new perspective, and yeah, and then you sometimes recognize that when you're just sitting at home, as we all are right now,
Mhm.
consuming media through our screens, but we'll see things that we recognize, and that connects us both with it, not only with a different place, but also with a different time, because in some cases that these are places that I went to many years ago, and so it was a different part of my life at that point.
Yeah. Well, even not even that too. It's also like when it was built too. Like I remember going to the East Coast and being like, wow, this stuff is pretty old.
Yeah.
Like, because I'm from the West Coast and everything here is relatively new. But
Yeah,
then you
so
go
you
to
go to a
East
place like
Coast,
Boston and you
yeah,
realize, oh, these streets have been laid out this way for 300 years.
right, exactly.
It gives you
And then
personal
you,
perspective.
mhm.
Uh, and then you go to Europe and then you
Oh
see, oh,
man.
wait a minute. These streets have been laid out for like 500 years or 700 years.
Mhm.
Or, you go to Rome and it's like, oh, no, this street has been here for 2,000 years.
Yep. Yeah. And then you're like, wait a second, we're like babies over here. It's
Yeah, it's like
compared to
scratching the
everything
surface.
else. Yeah, so that's really cool. I definitely had the same exact experience when I went to East Coast at first. It was really weird when you go to like old places and like you go up the stairs or whatever, and you can feel the you can feel like the groove in it just from like
Yeah, yeah,
everywhere.
yeah. I think,
That's crazy.
yeah, I lived in an apartment in Boston that was built about 100 years ago, and yeah, you could tell the staircase was sort of rutted a little bit because it had been in use more or less that long. Yeah, and you'll see that in other places where this. Yeah, you'll see that with the staircases, or sometimes I don't know if you see this much in the U.S. I've seen this more in Europe, where like in
Hmm.
the U.K., for example, where you go to an old enough building and you see that the glass has has flowed down because glass is a liquid. So if you put a pane of glass in and you leave it for 150 years, it will flow down, and so the glass is thinner at the top and thicker at the bottom. It's amazing.
Oh, wow. I didn't even notice that, but I guess I must have seen that. I just never noticed it.
Yeah, it takes a long time for that to happen. So nowadays glass doesn't get left in that long. But if you look at especially old church buildings where they don't tend to change the glass very often, you might see some glass that's more than 100 years old, and then you might be able to see this.
Yeah, there's some crazy stuff that's really really old. What have been the best places, most picturesque places for you?
Oh, with so many places to choose from, it's really hard.
That's true.
I mean, part of what makes them memorable for me is when they're really novel. So, um, like I went to South Africa um, in a couple of years ago. That was my first time being anywhere in Africa, and so that was totally different. Um, my sister was living there at the time, so I went around a little bit with her, and we went to Victoria Falls and some places in South Africa, and yeah, I mean, it was so different than traveling in Europe or traveling in Asia had been
I
that
would
it
imagine.
really stuck out for me because of how really different it was. But going to Australia and New Zealand have both been really interesting. I really like traveling in Japan. I've been to Japan many times, and I feel like every time I discover new things there. My
Yeah.
family is from India, so that's fascinating for kind of its own reasons. Because I mean, I'll go places that I've been with family, but I also go places that I'd only been by myself, and kind of explore that way. Um, yeah, and I spend a lot of time in Europe, so I know a lot of places in Europe pretty well, and there are lots of distinctive spots um, around Europe. Uh,
Yeah. Have you ever done the whole like backpacking through Europe kind of thing?
I never did that exactly. When I was in college, I spent a half a year studying in Hungary. So I did a little bit of the Eurail thing where I would ride trains. I took the train all the way to Berlin, which took like 10 hours, and I went to Poland and the Czech and Slovakia, Austria, Romania. So I saw a lot of Eastern Europe by train. Um,
It's really cool to be able to go by train versus like
yeah, trains are a totally underrated form of transportation
I love
by
trains.
people in the U.S. We don't have a lot of trains that sort of run in useful directions. I mean, I've taken the train between San Diego and Los Angeles a few times, um, and it's more useful than people realize. But and I've taken the train since I lived on the East Coast for a lot of my life. Taken the train between Washington and New York and Boston, plenty of times. But yeah, we don't have a lot of other train routes that go through sort of settled areas. And yeah, whereas in Europe, it's much more normal to take a train, for 2 or 3 hours to get from, one country to another, or,
Yeah.
one major city to another. Like in France, basically all of France is connected by train to Paris within about a 3-hour trip because of the TGV. And so it's just the most common way that people get around, especially, well, at least if you're going between Paris and somewhere else, is you take the train. You don't get on a plane. And yeah, Germany, a lot of there are lots of train routes between major cities. And yeah, and Japan, of course, is famous for its bullet trains.
Oh, yeah.
So Japan essentially is like almost a one-dimensional country because the main island runs sort of north-south, and so there's a high-speed train network running all the way from the north of the island to the south of the island, and all the major cities are along a single train route. So it's when I go to Japan, essentially I'll fly to Tokyo and then just take the train no matter where I'm going.
Yeah, definitely.
And it's very pretty. There are some really scenic spots on those train routes too. Like I think there's some spot where you get a really great view of Mount Fuji just on the train because it happens to go by, and there's a 14,000-foot mountain right behind you.
I haven't been able to ride the bullet train yet, but I really want to the next time we go. Just the local, I guess, train system where just from between stops and stuff was astounding to me when we went. You could pretty much go anywhere with those. Yeah,
especially in Tokyo and some of the other big cities. I mean, Tokyo more so than any place else. It's super interconnected by train. You can get around everywhere, and even if you don't read any Japanese, most of the stations are labeled in English. So if you know where you're trying to get to, you can figure out on the train map what trains you have to take. And okay, you're going to be in a throng of tens of thousands of people, but you'll figure it out.
Yeah, they were very helpful, even though I didn't speak too much when I first went there. And sometimes they don't speak too much English, but they're still very helpful.
Yeah, people will want to be helpful even if the language skills aren't necessarily available. But that's one of the adventurous things in a good way about traveling is sometimes you'll find yourself in a place where you just don't have any language to communicate with the local people, but you figure it out somehow.
I think there's something
it's kind of like solving a puzzle that, okay, I have to get this done. I can't use words, at least not complete sentences, but I know that the people around me are intelligent human beings who do certain things and can figure out from context what's going on, and how do I manage the situation that way.
Yeah, I think when you're learning a language, or I think at the beginning it's kind of like it's just this arcane, like mysterious, like encryption or whatever, but it's really
especially if you have one of those teachers that insists on day one they walk into the class and they start speaking in that language, and they don't give you anything in your language, and they want you to just figure it out, like the way a child would when learning language for the first time, is that they don't have any words, but they can see what's going on and they're hearing stuff. And okay, you have a bit of an advantage in that you have, a language already. You can sort of use that to reason out things, but yeah, you have to figure out the correspondence between words and things. First you have to maybe even figure out which ones are the words, right? Because when you hear just a continuous stream of talk, where do the words start and where the words end? This gave me a lot of trouble the first time I tried to listen to French, because French has this French has this phenomenon of liaison where they don't really finish any of the words and they jam them into the next word. So it's kind of hard to pick out individual words until you actually know some words. because then you'll know what word they didn't finish saying when they started the next word.
Right? That was always the hardest part for me, and sometimes still is with French. Is just like they speak fast and they don't
They
say
speak fast, and
everything.
yeah, it's all concatenated. So yeah, it can be hard to pick out an individual word unless you can put the entire sentence together in your head, which I find much more challenging than, like, when I was learning Spanish, I didn't have this problem because I could pick out words. So I could at least work from the point of view of, okay, here's a word. I understand this word and this word. And so I can probably guess that the other words are, the other things that are needed to make the sentence grammatical, like a verb and a subject.
Yeah, versus okay, so I didn't know how I've never actually studied Spanish, but glad to know that they don't cut out half their words.
It depends who your Spanish, the speaker is. So, because Spanish is spoken in many places around the world by people with very different accents. So
No,
I learned Spanish mostly from teachers from either Cuba or Puerto Rico or Argentina. Western hemisphere.
Mm.
The first time I went to Spain and I heard, people from Madrid speaking Spanish, I couldn't understand a word of it. The language is similar. It's mostly the same. It's, about as similar as American English versus British English. But the accent I found is a lot more different than between, US English and British English. So I was completely lost at first. I got used to it, but yeah, I still find it easier to listen to Spanish speakers from the Western Hemisphere.
Right. I guess that makes sense, right? I even sometimes when I'm watching a show or something, I don't understand what the British English is, so I can't imagine sometimes doing other accents for other languages.
Yeah, I mean, of course, even in English, we have more choices than that, right? Because, okay, you go to Australia, that's pretty different. You go to New Zealand, that's even more different. You go to South Africa, that's a little different. You go to India, where, which is one of the largest population of English speakers in the world, but most of them speak it as a second language. A few speak it natively, but there is an Indian accent of English, or a variety of them, really. But and those are pretty different as well. I mean, you could certainly have native speakers of English from different places that can't understand each other. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah.
Even though it's nominally one language.
Mm-hmm. There are quite a lot of differences. I mean, there's people who study like those like individual ones, I think, right?
Yeah, I mean, those sort of regional versions of English, have enough differences between them that you can, people will compile like lists of words that have different uses in American English versus British English, or cases where the word is just a different word that's used in Britain versus the US. And yeah, the first time one goes to Britain, it's helpful to know a few of these, just so that you don't get completely confused about basic
just
conversation.
Referring to everything as something else. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, yeah. Are you learning any languages right now?
I've been doing Mandarin since actually before the pandemic started, but I really got into it once the pandemic started. So I have one of these language apps. This is Duolingo that I use on my phone, and so I'll just do 5 minutes of Chinese a day. And I don't know how much you really get out of 5 minutes a day, but I feel like it makes a lot more sense. At least just like basic sentences make a lot more sense. Like I can see like how a sentence is put together, even if I would have a lot of trouble putting together, even a basic sentence myself.
Yeah. I think once you learn the basic structure and I guess syntax of a language, it gets a lot easier.
Yeah, I mean, it gets to the point when you can pick up words that sort of there's a sort of changeover point when you really are just trying to figure out what's going on at some global level versus, okay, now I understand how to put a sentence together with a blank. You can, once you know how to sort of construct a sentence that has a blank in it, and you can fill the blank in with, say, a noun. Now you can make lots of sentences.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I think for at least the Eastern Asian languages, some like my sisters when they see me studying or something, they're like, "But how do you know when the word ends? There's no spaces or anything." But so
Right.
sometimes they're really different, but you do get the hang of it relatively fast, I think.
Yeah, that, like doesn't right. This concept of words of having kind of discrete words that are separate isn't natural in all languages. I mean, in some languages it's very natural because you kind of do stuff to a word and then that you add a prefix or a suffix to it and then that kind of clearly means that you're separating it from another word. But yeah, in Chinese, when you read Chinese, you just see a string of characters, and in context, when you put certain characters next to each other, they they kind of their meanings come together and they become a new word. But is that really a new word, or is it? There's a sort of semantic question about where does one word stop and another word start? When you
Yeah.
have two things that you've put together, is that two different words that you're using them as a phrase, and that phrase has a meaning separate from the two words, or have you made a compound word? Well, that's not a well-defined question in a language like Chinese because there's just no separation between words.
Yeah, that's true, and that's part of the reason why I think I never did get into learning like Chinese because I was like, well, how does that work? I mean, each you learn each character, I guess, but is each
Yeah,
character
and
considered?
you also
Yeah,
learn. I mean, you learn groups of characters that have meaning as words. I mean, in practice, the way you think about it for yourself is, you'll have sets of words in your head that have meaning. Maybe you think of it as a word, or maybe you think of it as a phrase, but you don't. After you kind of learn some individual characters, you also learn them in clusters that mean something. And so you kind of use those like words, but are you really using them like words? Or are you using them like set phrases? Well, that's neither here nor there in a language like Chinese.
yeah, yeah,
But it's all part of the process. Is you start with kind of building blocks, which in Chinese are very discrete. They are individual characters that have a pronunciation and some kind of a basic meaning, and then you start putting them together. And in some ways, it's easier than other languages because for the most part, nothing funny happens when you put those characters together, right? You don't have morphology as much as you do in English, where okay, you put a suffix on something, but you might change the pronunciation or you might change the spelling. Um, in Chinese, when you put two things together, they stay phonetically separate. So at least that doesn't complicate matters.
yeah. There's not a bunch of
You can then
special
just worry
rules.
about the meaning.
Hmm, that's interesting. Well, how about the phonetics? I hear that's a hard part
That
with
is
the spoken language.
definitely hard for somebody not used to a language like that. Yeah, that because it's a tonal language. That's the first point. And those of us who grew up speaking non-East Asian languages, for the most part, aren't used to thinking of the pitch of a word as having something to do with its meaning, right? When we speak English, we use intonation not to distinguish between the meanings of different words, but to create sentence structure.
Yeah.
So my pitch goes down at the end of a declarative sentence. But in Chinese, individual characters have pitches. Some of them go up, some of them go down. And you actually distinguish words that way. If you change the pitch on a syllable, it becomes a completely different word.
Mhm.
And it might, sometimes it becomes the opposite word. It's incredibly
Right.
confusing. Yeah, that is very tricky to get used to. I guess you have to first get used to hearing that, and then you have to start trying to produce it. But even just hearing it takes some practice.
Yeah, I think like for me, Tagalog, I don't know how tonal it is, but like sometimes I would say something and then my grandparents would be like, "Wait, what did you just say?" And then they tell me what I just said, and I was like, "That's not what I said." It's
Which language is
completely
this?
wrong. Huh?
Which language are we talking about?
Tagalog.
In Tagalog. Oh yeah, does that have a tonal aspect? Maybe.
well, I don't know if it's tonal precisely, but there's stressing the words in a different way creates an entirely different meaning
Oh
sometimes.
yeah, I mean we have a
So
little bit of that in English, but maybe not so common.
yeah. Oh no. Like this would be like it would be a different word in
It's a
English,
completely
pretty
different
much.
word. It's
Yeah.
not even just like a different meaning of the same related, but yeah.
Mm. Yeah, it's weird.
Yeah, that might make things yeah, that could make things complicated.
Yeah. That's kind of why I think I gravitated more towards like Japanese and Korean because it was a much easier pronunciation.
Yeah, those languages have very clear phonology. Um, so you can get started, and Korean even has the advantage that it's all written in a phonetic alphabet. So
Yes. Yeah.
if you see it, you can read it out loud, and then you just have to figure out what it means.
Mhm.
It's kind of the opposite of Chinese that way.
Yeah, I guess
That
so.
it's all the Chinese writing is all meaning and no phonetics at all. And Korean is completely the opposite.
Mm. Which is pretty interesting. I don't know. I found this out when we went there, but apparently Korean's like a synthetic language. Like the king ordered it to be made or something like that.
The alphabet is definitely that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I gather so they were using Chinese characters before that,
Mm.
which wasn't a really a good fit for the Korean language because it's so different from Chinese. Um, so yeah, at some point, whoever was in charge kind of commissioned an alphabet to be designed, and yeah, it was actually um, it's actually a really interesting alphabet. That the characters are designed. The design of the physical design of the letters of the alphabet has a lot of linguistics built into it. It may have been inspired by Sanskrit, and that because the sort of earliest linguistics that we have is sort of ancient. There's ancient a lot of text in Sanskrit about the linguistics initially of Sanskrit itself.
Mm.
And so like the Sanskrit alphabet is organized in a sort of phonetic way where there's like a 5x5 table of consonants, where you sort of, when you go one way, you're sort of moving the articulation point of the consonant from back to front in your mouth. And you go the other way and you're changing, what is it? You're going from, so yeah, I don't remember off the top of my head. But there's sort of two axes on which they kind of sort all the consonants. And the Korean alphabet sort of takes that into account and also takes into account vowel placement. And so the symbols for each character are sort of a phonetic or pictorial representation of how you articulate that sound.
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, I never thought of it like that, but that's true. The first I guess you could say consonant would be like in the top left and then the vowel and then the
Yeah.
ending.
Yeah,
I
and
never
like
thought of it like that, yeah.
whether it's sort of a circle or a square has to do with like, is your mouth rounded or like flat, or this kind of thing. There's some internal logic in that which is really interesting.
Oh, that's really cool. There's so much stuff that you don't know, like
Yeah, it makes me wish I knew any Korean. I've been to Korea a couple of times and I know zero Korean, but the alphabet is so cool. It makes me want to learn.
You should learn it. It's one of those alphabets. Well, I don't know if there's other alphabets like this, but you could probably pick it up within like a day.
Yeah, I mean, the times I've been to Korea, basically I would spend a week cramming the alphabet so that I could read signs, but then I forget it again. Because I've only been to Korea maybe 3 times. So it hasn't come up so much, but
yeah. It's a fun language. I don't know. Do you watch Korean dramas?
No, that might be. Yeah, I guess if I were more into Korean movies or K-pop or this kind of thing, I might have more incentive to pick it up. Yeah, I haven't even seen Parasite.
Oh, you haven't?
That's how out of touch I am with, Korean cultures. I haven't seen, their Oscar-winning Best Picture.
Yeah, that's probably something you should watch soon. But yeah, what
Maybe
what
next
have you
time,
been?
before I go to Korea, I'll watch it.
Yeah. What have you been watching? Do you watch what do you usually do
I
when
don't
you're?
I don't tend to watch a lot of TV or movies.
Yeah, I'm kind of the same way.
Yeah, I don't know that's not something that I tend to do for diversion. I mean, I'll watch movies when I'm traveling because they'll have them on the plane, and I'll sometimes get caught up with movies that way or TV. But um, yeah, I mean, I subscribe to some music podcasts, and so I hear a lot of music that way. But I don't tend to consume a lot of
Podcasts.
TV or movies.
Music podcasts, like they put music together, or they talk
Well,
about.
yeah, just like mostly the NPR music podcasts, like All Songs Considered, and where they tend to showcase new artists or new releases and this kind of thing.
Oh, okay.
So I just have some idea of what's coming out currently.
Oh, that's cool. I honestly didn't even know they had that.
Yeah, they have
There's.
a whole series of
Oh, wow.
uh, music podcasts with different genres as well. So there's like um, yeah, there's the sort of general one, and then there are some targeted ones. I don't know. I don't listen to the targeted ones, so I don't know exactly what genres they're covering. But.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I was first starting this podcast, I was really, really surprised, like looking at all the other categories of podcasts, because like they were probably over 20 podcasts just about like aviation. And I was
Yeah,
really surprised. I was like,
the
what?
thing with the podcast is, you don't need much of an audience. I guess people have used the term narrowcasting to refer to this, where when audio content was something that you were putting over radio waves or broadcasting, as it were. Since everybody was going to be hearing kind of the same content, you had to choose content that was applicable to a general audience. But in the modern media framework, you can do narrowcasting, where you put something out, and only the people who are actually interested will find it and will listen to it. So yeah, you can have lots of people talking about something narrow, like aviation, and the people who are interested will find it, and
Yeah.
the rest of us will be blissfully ignorant that these things even exist, and it doesn't matter because the people who want to consume it have found it.
Right. Yeah. And that's kind of the beauty of podcasts. I really enjoy them because
Yeah.
you really, well, I guess in the internet in general, you could pretty much find whatever you're looking for.
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge, cultural change from, when I was a kid, right? Because I didn't really get access to the internet until I was in college. Um, and it was still, that was internet 1.0. So there wasn't as much, not nearly as much content as nowadays. Search engines took a while to come around, so you could really find things.
Mm.
But yeah, specialty interests are now things that you can find your people, you can find your tribe. If you're interested in something very specific, there are probably, it's a big planet. There are probably a few hundred or more people out there who have a similar interest. You can find them, and you can share content with them,
Yeah.
no matter what it is.
That's awesome to me. And yeah, you can make a pretty closely knit community just bonding over something really.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I guess speaking of, so I know you told me you were into crossword puzzles, but I think we kind of ran out of time last time we were talking about it. Are there any? Do they have like online competitions?
Yeah, right now because of the pandemic. So
Yeah.
the biggest crossword tournament in the U.S. is called the American Crossword Puzzle Tournament. I've attended that many times.
Do they have it this year?
They're having, so that last year they ended up canceling it. This year they're having it, but they're having it as a virtual event. So everybody is going to be doing it online, and the top competitors are going to be doing it, with their videos turned on, so people will be watching them solve. Yeah, so like everything else, that kind of event had to adapt to online. So they're using some online platform where you solve the puzzle by typing in on a computer. Lots of people do solve, like, the New York Times crossword puzzle online. That's been true. They've had the crossword puzzle available online for a long time now, and they've updated the apps that you use through the website, and I think probably most people by now are solving it through the website rather, or the app on a phone, or some other device, rather than on a physical copy of the newspaper, or even printing it out. So because it's convenient.
Right. How would the
so there are some, on crossword competitions, typically most of them were done on paper in person, but they've had to adapt to the pandemic, just like everything else.
I guess, well, there were a couple of events that I wanted to go to, not specifically competition type stuff, but like conventions, which are online. It's really different. Like, they're trying to, you still have all the same panels and all the same performances and whatever. I think the meeting people is such a huge part that the convention is it's just completely different. It's not.
Yeah, we haven't got great workarounds for that. I know there are platforms that people have tried to use to kind of simulate the experience of being in a physical space and talking to people just that you're standing next to. There are a few platforms that are available that try to reproduce this. I've used one or two of them, but it's still looking at people in a box on a screen. It's still quite limited. So I imagine once travel restrictions loosen up, a lot of the in-person events that used to happen will just go back to the way they were before, possibly with some content available online for people who can't get there. So we might see some hybridization. Like, I know some research math conferences, have discussed the possibility of, is there some way to make some of the content available for people who aren't there in person? Well, you can record lectures, but like the informal back and forth, how much of that can you make available to people who weren't able to physically go there?
Right.
And, well, obviously not all of it, but you'd like to strike some balance. Obviously it's a much richer experience if you can attend in person, but it's not everybody is going to be able to attend in person for reasons of finances, or potentially political restrictions. Some places you can't travel, if there are political disputes, or maybe you don't want to travel as much because you're worried about climate change. So there needs to be some middle ground, but definitely there is still a need. One of the things that we've learned from the pandemic is, for all the promise people have, especially people who make software that supports online collaboration like Zoom, for all the promises that have been made about the use of online collaboration tools, there's still a lot of limitations. And there's still a lot that works better when people can actually gather in person.
Yeah. Well, I guess speaking of, while you were talking about that, I was thinking, have you ever used VR?
I have not, actually. That is not something that I've done much experimentation with. Um, I yeah, I'm a little concerned that I might get motion sick from it.
Oh yeah.
But I guess that maybe that just takes some getting used to. But I've never really tried it. No.
Oh, okay. No, it's a really surreal experience. I guess our school like fundraised one so that we were able to get one at our high school, which was really cool. But like when you use it, it's really, I don't know, it's immersive in a weird way because like I don't know, it's weird to describe. But maybe that could be a way.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess the idea is that you would then like multiple people would interact within the VR environment, even though they're potentially in different locations.
Yeah. Like all of those sci-fi movies that have the same exact premise.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
holodeck.
Huh?
like being on the holodeck.
Yeah.
Okay.
That I don't know. That would be interesting. And probably not too far off, I think. But yeah, that would be cool. I don't know too much about it though.
Yeah, I mean, people have discussed like one of the areas that people have discussed. Um, the premise, the benefits of using remote technology is, of course, education. Are we all, are universities, physical in-person teaching at a university, is that still something that makes sense? And well, I don't know about anybody else, but certainly my impression is that most people involved with education on either side would really like to get back to having classes in person.
Yes.
There are some benefits to what we've been forced to do with remote education. I think forcing all the professors to learn how to use recording equipment, may pay some dividends later. Just in terms of, having content available, like having lectures recorded so that students can watch them again is a good thing. And it's not something that lots of us would have bothered to learn how to do had we not been forced to. But, not having the opportunity to interact, have office hours in person, or for students to not be able to collaborate easily in person. I think that's very disruptive. I mean, like part of the premise of having a campus is for students to interact with each other. And I feel like very, very much disrupted in the current environment, especially for students who started in a new environment, like started high school or started university, in the middle of the pandemic, haven't met their classmates. Look, that's up on screens, but you don't really build connections that way.
Yeah, I have some classmates that I talk to somewhat frequently, and I don't even know what they look like. It's weird.
So you don't use like Zoom with cameras on to interact with them. You're using other channels like Discord or something.
Well, I have with a couple of my friends. We've met up on here or in other places like online, but like some people you'll meet through like Discord or something else, and it's just text,
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, or maybe you can do a voice call.
Maybe, but most people aren't too inclined to show their face or their voice, and it's really weird. I don't know.
That's been really interesting for me as teaching a class.
Yeah.
That I have. Okay, so when I teach my lectures, because I'm recording the lecture, I set it up so that I'm the only one talking, and that's fine. I kind of got used to that. But I'll have office hours, and people don't turn their camera on for office hours. That I find a little bit weird. No, most students will not turn their cameras on when they're coming to office hours. Just a couple of them will.
That's interesting.
And I mean, I can imagine why they might not. I mean, they're probably living in some they're probably in some environment where the camera is going to pick up everything behind them, and maybe they don't want to broadcast their bedroom, or so I get it, but yeah. It's still a little disconcerting to have had all these students where the only sense I have of what they look like is their photos, that I get from the registrar. So I've been, teaching these students for a whole term, and I only have a still photo of them that possibly is not even current.
Wow.
That has been particularly challenging. But you don't really get to know students well that way if you can't put. I mean, I have enough trouble putting names to faces when we're in person, when I don't have the faces.
Oh, right. Yeah, you only have one. Only have
It's
names.
kind of hopeless.
That is strange. Well, do you find that there's? I know you said that people aren't turning their cameras on, but are there less people compared to in person? Because I feel like it's more
I have a little bit
online,
of trouble judging that, because the class, the classes that I've been teaching so far are actually classes I haven't taught at UCSD before. So I don't have a baseline. So but if I compare to other classes of a similar sort, like if I compare the cryptography class from last term with other upper division undergraduate math courses that I've taught, like 100 algebra, or I teach a math software class. I would typically have anywhere from 3 to like 10 people in my office at a time. I mean, like spilling out into the hallway for office hours. And the only time I had more than 2 students at a time for office hours was the very last week when we were doing final projects, when I think I got up to maybe 5.
Wow, record setting.
Yeah, but so again, I can't compare like for like, because it's not a class I've taught before in person. But my guess is that I would have had more students coming in person.
Yeah. Like in theory, it should be more accessible, I suppose. I mean, because
in principle, it's just you just turn on your Zoom and there. You don't have to cross campus. You don't have to. I mean, you can leave your camera off if you want, and then in that sense, it's sort of easier psychologically than actually walking into a professor's office. That can be pretty intimidating. Showing up in a Zoom with your camera off, and just even just showing up and lurking, like not turning on your phone, your camera, or your microphone. That's a pretty low bar, and students weren't even doing that.
I do that sometimes. Well, I'll just show up to office hours, see what other questions anyone else has, and I don't know, just sit there. Sometimes with my camera on, but sometimes it's a different atmosphere, Like that would be okay, I guess, if I went to the actual.
I mean, yeah, it's perfectly okay for in-person office hours to just come and sit and listen, and not be asking questions. That's completely fine, and students will do that. They'll come, or maybe they'll come in a group where one of them has a question and the others just want to hear the answer, or sometimes somebody will just come because they're going to work on the problem set, and they just want to hear what, or maybe they haven't worked on it yet, and they want to hear some of the issues that are going to come up, so that they don't have to ask the same question later. But so there wasn't as much of that going on as I would have expected.
Well, at least on my end, I can tell you it feels a little bit weird, because you show up, like that's definitely something I would do, but I would show up to, I don't know, Zoom office hours or whatever, but it's almost like I take up too much space, if that makes sense. Like if there's only one other person in there, and then I'm just sitting there with my little box that's not little. I don't know.
It actually, technically it doesn't take up space. Like when I set up my Zoom, I have it so that the non-video participants are not showing up in boxes. So all that's happening is they're showing up in the participant list.
Oh, okay.
Right. I'm not seeing empty tiles for people who don't have their video turned on.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
That's an option you can change, but of course
I
you
do
don't
see
know
that.
what the person on the other end is doing. But I tend to do that when I have a, especially if it's a large group, like if it's for a seminar or something, when there are like, okay, so we have research seminars in the math department, and of course we've
Mhm.
been doing them online because it's the pandemic.
Oh yeah.
So we'll have 25 people joining, including lots of graduate students, and most people will turn off their camera. Usually it's the speaker and the host and maybe a couple of other people will turn cameras on. It's good to have a couple of people with cameras on so the speaker gets some visual feedback. So that they know that they haven't been disconnected, for example.
Right.
If somebody is still reacting to them, they know that they should keep going. But yeah, most people will turn their cameras off to save bandwidth and also you know certainly speaking when I'm sitting in a seminar, different seminar, like one that I'm not hosting,
Mhm.
yeah, I'll usually have my camera turned off, because I might not even be standing in front of the computer. I might step out to refresh my teacup or if the doorbell rings and I have to bring in a grocery order
Yeah, yeah.
because that happens in this environment. Um,
Well, I guess speaking of, how did it go? I remember you mentioned you were having a seminar yesterday in Spanish.
oh yeah, that was exciting, kind of terrifying. Yeah, so it was my first time giving a talk in Spanish. Um, I started attending this seminar in Spanish when the pandemic started. So one of the things that happened when the pandemic started is that everybody put their seminars online, and a few places, like we made our seminar publicly available online. I mean, we got quite a lot of people from outside San Diego. We had people from the East Coast, people from Europe, people from Asia. We had people from all over attending the seminar. And of course, lots of other seminars got put online. And somebody who's actually one of my collaborators actually put together a website called researchseminars.org, where people can post seminar listings. Especially things that are open to the public, so that you can sort of find out what seminars are available. And so, I would go through and I would see, oh, there's a seminar at, Columbia, or the seminar at Princeton that I'm interested in. And then one of the seminars that got created early on in the pandemic was this thing called the Latin American Number Theory Seminar, which was, I think the organizers are in Uruguay. There's a couple in Argentina. There might be others, I don't remember. So they have a seminar, there might be one in Chile. So they have a seminar that's in Spanish on number theory. And since, that's both my topic and it's a language I can understand and, wanted to sort of brush up on, I started attending the seminar. And at some point, they noticed that somebody who wasn't obviously a Spanish speaker was attending the seminar, and asked if I was interested in giving a talk. And I thought about it for a long time. And eventually I said, okay. I gave this talk.
Mm.
But yeah, it took a lot of preparation. Giving a talk in not your first language, and not a language that you use on a regular basis either.
Mm.
Took some preparation. I mean, I was giving a talk that I had given a version of in English. So I started with the English version of the talk and hit it with Google Translate to see what happened. And that worked okay, but of course it wasn't enough. I had to clean up a bunch of things, but
Yeah.
it definitely made it much easier.
Mm-hmm.
And then since I had a kind of prepared text and slides, to give the talk, that made it easier to actually give the talk, because a lot of the talk was me saying things that were written down already.
Yeah, and I guess you had covered the topic before in previous.
Yeah, and of course the material is material. I mean, not only had I presented the material before, but of course I worked on the research as well.
Yeah, right.
Presenting a theorem that I had talked about in other venues, and had even had the chance to talk about with a reporter or two. Because it's It's actually it comes out to something quite elementary. It's a sort of it's a result in Euclidean geometry. So I can even state the theorem for you if you want. So what we did was we classified all the ways that you could draw lines in three-dimensional space, so that any two lines make an angle which is a rational number of degrees, so like 90 degrees or 60 degrees or 7 degrees.
Wait, did you say three intersecting lines or what?
Any number of lines. Say they all go through a common point, just so I can measure angles that way. So I take a bunch of lines through the origin. So if you pick a coordinate system. But the condition that I want to impose is that any two lines make a rational angle.
Okay.
And so the problem is, can you classify all the ways this can happen? And it turns out you can. You can describe sort of what you describe are the sort of maximal configurations where, if you have a configuration like this, you can take lines out and it doesn't hurt you. So you really only need to figure out all the ways you can sort of put a bunch of lines together like this so that you have no room to add any more. So you describe all of those configurations. And those turn out to have a lot of interesting geometric properties. There are some ones that come from really funny geometric shapes. But proving that you've got all of them is pretty non-trivial. So there's a lot of there's a back and forth between there's sort of an algorithm that in principle works, but it's not feasible. So there's a back and forth between theory and computer calculations to get this done.
Yeah, I was wondering what actual math researchers' opinions were on algorithmic based software for proofs.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of become indispensable. I mean, the most famous, I think the first really famous example of using a computer to prove a theorem was the four-color theorem, right? So that happened in the 1970s, I think, so quite early in the era of computers. Right, the four-color problem was, about, I guess it was originally formulated in terms of you had maps where you would shade each country in a color, and you wanted different countries that were adjacent to have different colors so that you could see the border between them. It didn't matter if they touched a corner because you would see that, but if they had an edge in common, you wanted those to be distinguishable. And at some point, somebody discovered that they'd always seemed to be possible to draw maps with only four colors. And then somebody tried to prove this in the 19th century, and it turned out there was a mistake, which was only discovered 10 years later. And then this problem became a notorious open problem for much of the 20th century. And finally, it took a computer-assisted proof in the 1970s to straighten it out. And once that happened, I think that sort of opened the doors to computer-assisted mathematics. People really got used to the idea that some mathematical proofs are complicated enough that you shouldn't trust the human brain to check all the steps. You should somehow automate this. And so now you have lots of examples. I think I mentioned a few in my talk. So there's one called the Kepler Conjecture, which is about the optimal way to pack spheres in three-dimensional space. That was resolved by a computer-assisted proof. There was an old problem about when the Rubik's Cube came out back in, I guess it was the early 1980s. Right, the Rubik's Cube was a huge thing back when we didn't have the internet. People got obsessed with it. And so one of the questions people asked was, well, if you start with an arbitrary position of a Rubik's Cube, what is the minimum number of moves that is guaranteed to be sufficient to unscramble it, no matter where you start? So what is the worst case for the number of moves that you need to take? And so it was eventually proved by a computer-assisted argument that you can always do it in at most 20 steps. This problem is sometimes called the problem of God's algorithm, because if an omniscient being is solving Rubik's Cube, what is the minimum number of steps that the omniscient being would take? If you actually try to do Rubik's Cube using a human understandable algorithm, typically you use more steps.
I would
unless
imagine
you're unless you're a sport speed solver, in which case you really try to optimize it. But yeah, and there are other examples like this where the proofs are sufficiently complex that you really want to use computer tools to verify steps. Yeah. But you really have to distinguish between, calculations that give an answer that seems to be the correct answer versus calculations that actually give a proof. So, for example, in this came up in our work. It also came up with the Kepler conjecture. Right, you're doing computations involving real numbers. Real numbers, when you try to write down a real number, typically it has an infinite decimal expansion. Like pi is an infinite decimal expansion. That's not something you can represent on a computer because a computer has a finite amount of space to keep track of things. So you don't keep track of an infinite number of decimal digits, you truncate it and you round things off, which is all well and good in real life, but when you're trying to prove a mathematical theorem, you want a proof that rounding things off didn't cause an error somewhere down the line. And so you actually have to keep track of how much have you rounded things off, and is that enough to really cause a problem? So when we were doing our calculations, some of our calculations we would run with real numbers on the computer, and they were sufficiently on the edge that we said, okay, we can't guarantee that these calculations were error-free. We're going to do them again with many more digits, and it's going to take longer, but we're going to do that just so that we can give an airtight proof that no errors have contributed to the result we're seeing.
Okay, so it sounds like there's like a sort of like a confidence interval then, or something?
Yeah, well, for math, right, there is, but for mathematicians, the confidence interval has to be like absolutely 100%. Like,
yeah, okay, that would make sense.
So mathematicians want, not beyond a reasonable doubt, but beyond, any doubt, even if it's not reasonable. So
I guess that would make sense why.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difference of styles between, working in a subject where, you'll get some sort of feedback on whether there was an error in something, versus, I mean, in mathematics, ultimately, most of the things we're doing as mathematicians involve proving results. So we have this notion of absolute proof, and we're trying not just to approximate absolute proof, but to actually achieve absolute proof. And you can do that. Which maybe it's a little surprising that you can actually do that, but it takes some work. Right. So maybe the takeaway is not that we're being picky, is that we're actually able to achieve the mathematical standard of absolute proof, even though we're using computers in the calculation.
Right. But it sounds like using a computer is not as easy as just inputting your problem and having it test every solution.
Yeah, it's not just a matter of start the computer, ask it to tell you what the answer is. You get the answer, you say you accept it. There's more back and forth between the end user and essentially the programmer, whoever's sort of sitting on the other side running the software. There's the person writing the software has a higher degree of responsibility when the outcome that's desired is a mathematical proof. Often software packages will allow you to choose whether or not you want to insist on that standard. So if you say you're trying to figure out whether some number is prime because it's a cryptography application, something you want to do RSA. So you type in a big number, you ask the computer, is it prime? And you can typically ask for, is it prime probably, or is it prime with a proof? And if you ask for, is it a prime probably, it will do things like the Fermat test and other efficient tests for primality. And if it passes all the tests, it'll say, okay, it's got to be prime. It's just gotta be. The chance of it not being prime is like 1 in 2 to the 100 or something, which is great unless you're a mathematician and you want a proof for some reason. In which case you go back and you say, okay, now this time I want you to prove it for me, and then it'll run a different algorithm which takes much longer, but at the end it'll spit back out something that actually gives you a proof.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that definitely I would imagine it would take a very long time.
It depends on the situation. For primality testing, it's not so bad. I mean, it's definitely the case that if you're trying to find a prime number, you should do this probabilistic thing first. You should pre-screen your candidates using the fast probably correct algorithm, mm-hmm. And then once you're done with that, once you have candidates, then you can pass them over to the provable test if you really want mathematical level of confidence. So if you're, for example, if you're submitting something for say the government is doing a competition about cryptography standards, and you want to propose using RSA with a particular modular, some particular prime for elliptic curve cryptography or something, then you would probably run the mathematical proof because you want to submit the mathematical proof to the competition. But if you're just using it for real life, probably the 2 to 100, the 1/2 to 100 level of confidence is probably good enough.
Yeah. There's always that thing between, or there's always that balance between, I guess, practicality and absolutes.
Yeah, I mean, part of the point of the mathematical proof, it means that you don't have to go back later and kind of increase the level of confidence. Because maybe you do something that will give you some degree of confidence, but if people end up using it over and over again, maybe eventually somebody wants more confidence. And well, if you've done a mathematical proof, then you don't have to go back and do that check for more confidence. Sort of have sort of infinite level of confidence to begin with.
Yeah, that's true. And I guess that would be pretty. I think we talked about that a lot, and I think that would be interesting to talk about in another time. But it looks like we're reaching about the hour. Did you have anything else you wanted to bring up real quick?
No, I think we talked about plenty already. I think.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to go over through here. But yeah, thanks for coming on today. I really appreciate
my pleasure.
it. I think it was pretty fun talking. So
I enjoyed it.
Yeah. So hopefully you guys enjoyed it, you listeners out there. And we will see you next week, 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. See you guys.